Welcome to the Skeptic Zone, the podcast from Australia for science and reason.
Yes, it's the Skeptic Zone podcast, episode number 613, and not unlucky. Richard Saunders coming to you from Sydney, Australia. Although in the last couple of days I've been in Newcastle, which is a little bit up the coast, visiting my friend and reporter Maynard, and I helped produce one of his live Mad Clubs. His one-man Mad Club. In this case, it was a two-man Mad Club. Maynard was the star of the show. For more on that, and to see the bizarre, wacky, crazy show that Maynard put together, head to maynard.com.au, and those who saw it know what I mean. But coming up on this week's show, we're going to kick off with our reporter Michelle Franklin in the Northern Territory, and a topic dear to my heart, water divining and water dowsing. And Michelle sort of has a bit of a rant about the problems she faces in that part of the country, having to dig down to find water. And she poses a very interesting question. She wonders, as you'll hear, if it's time for the skeptics to have another major water divining test. What do you think? Anyway, coming up at the top of the show, Life is Wild with Michelle Franklin. Following that, it's Michelle Bijkersma. This time, Michelle's going to be talking about face masks in the city where she's living, Melbourne, because much of Melbourne has gone back into lockdown for 6 weeks because of the very troubling surge of coronavirus. I don't know if they're calling this the second wave or if it's just a resurgence of the first wave or a bump, or I don't know what it is. But a lot of people in Melbourne are very worried, of course. But Michelle's going to be talking about masks, and she is now sporting a very fashionable mask herself. Find out more with Michelle Bijkersma coming up a bit later on. Then we have some lunatic flying in a plane, wondering about the shape of the earth. We'll get to that a bit later on. Not sure what that's all about. And then we have the Cas Files with Dr Cassandra Perryman. And this is quite a departure on the Skeptic Zone. Normally we don't have very political things at all. We sort of stick to science and reason and whatever. But you know what? In this case, I'm willing to make an exception for Dr. Cas. I think she makes some very good points about the current administration in the United States. And, I wonder what you'll think of this report. It's quite eye-opening, and I learnt a lot. That's the Cas Files. Then Michelle Bijkersma returns with her regular Logical Fallacies. This week, Michelle looks at the fallacy of tu quoque, which is also known as the appeal to hypocrisy, or also known as Look Who's Talking. Very popular segment. That's Logical Fallacies with Michelle Bijkersma. Then to round off the show, it's the Book of Tim with Tim Mendham, once more looking into the pages of the Skeptic magazine with the What Goes Round section. But now it's time for me to run downstairs and enjoy a nice hot buttered crumpet with a little bit of, yes, of course, a Vegemite. Either that or maybe some honey. I quite like honey. While I do that, I hope you enjoy the Skeptic Zone.
Life is Wild. With Michelle Franklin.
Hi, this is Michelle Franklin, reporting from the Northern Territory. I don't have any wildlife stories to talk about today, but I'm feeling pretty frustrated and I think I need to take a leaf out of Dr. Paulie's playbook and have a random rant. Where I live, there's no access to town water, so we have to be self-sufficient in that regard. It's usually pretty simple. You pay somebody, they drill your bore, and you're set for about 30 years. Unfortunately, my bore is now 29 years old, and I'm considering my options. There are lots of problems associated with bore water, one being that the population around me is growing. There are lots of people and lots of businesses sinking new bores every day, which means that it's getting harder and harder to get reliable water. Also, climate change is increasing the likelihood of poor rain years, which also impacts on water reliability. My bore's on its last legs, and I need to make a decision about a new one. But when I'm making an investment this size, I don't want to make the wrong choice. There are plenty of experts around, and actually having the bore drilled is a simple process, but choosing the location is a lot less simple. Besides looking up aquifers in my local area, I have no idea how to choose a spot. I'm lucky enough to have found a driller who doesn't believe in magic, so at least I can have a sensible conversation with him about the pros and cons of drilling at the original site. It seems the most obvious choice to put the new bore right beside the old one. I know that one worked for a long time, so it's probably not a bad spot, and I already have all the electricity and pipelines running to that location, so it would be a lot cheaper than laying new underground lines to the new spot. But if I want to try a new location, the driller isn't going to help me with that. His job is to dig, and he doesn't want the responsibility of choosing where that is. I know my best option is to look up aquifer locations and look at the height and position of my neighbouring bores, but ultimately it's up to me to choose a spot and hope for the best. I know there are bigger problems in the world right now than where to dig a hole, but I'm finding it extremely frustrating that I can't just bring it up in casual conversation with friends and neighbours. Just say, hey, I have this problem, what do you reckon I should do? Because seriously, every time I do, no matter who it is, the person knows someone who could divine for me. I've heard all the stories. My dad taught me how. It's really easy. You just think the word water and the wires move as you cross. Really? That's amazing. Did you test it on areas where you can check to see if there's water or not? No? Why not? My neighbour used this guy. I could get you his number if you want. He just used 2 wires and hit water at 60 metres. Seriously? In Howard Springs. You hit water in a town called Howard Springs. Well, fancy that. What are the odds? It must have been the magic guy who took your neighbour's money, hey? Well, my dad can do it. He gets water every time. He's been doing it for 50 years. Really? Do you think he could do it under test conditions? Yeah? Does he want $100,000? No? Oh, because he can't be bothered getting tested? Okay, that makes total sense. Honestly, this is the easiest form of confirmation bias I can think of, because all you have to do is keep digging and eventually you're going to hit an aquifer. And at $200 per metre for drilling and capping, why would you want to check? Let's just start digging and whatever happens, you're right, plus I get to pay you for the honour of not helping me at all. Every time I bring this up and someone offers to hook me up with their neighbour's mate's dad who can divine for me, I've told them about that time, way back before I was even born, when James Randi and Dick Smith and the first few members of the Australian Skeptics offered $50,000 to anyone who could divine for water for real, and they always seem surprised to hear that no one was able to do it. This is what really bothers me. They're not stupid people. These people who I talk to, some of them have science degrees and they're actually very intelligent. But they've always just accepted that people who hold sticks and think the magic word can find water by just walking around and hoping for it. When you explain the test to them, they seem perfectly capable of understanding the scientific method of testing. But until that moment, they'd never even considered that this was something that needed to be tested. It's just normal to pay someone to conduct a magic ritual on your property and make a financial decision on your behalf based on the outcome of their magic spell. I'm honestly thinking it might be time to repeat the tests. I think it's been too long and people have forgotten that all this is just BS. Maybe we need another public stunt like the original divining test from 1980 and remind people how ridiculous this is. I don't know, maybe I should just keep my mouth shut, pick a spot, pay the driller and hope for the best. I'll tell you what though, I would love to see a diviner who offers a money-back guarantee. How great would it be to pay someone, and I'd be willing to pay a fair bit, if someone could guarantee me water at 60 metres or higher. Any more than 60 and the rest of the drilling's free. But of course no one's going to offer that because deep down they all know that they're just as likely to be wrong as I am. That's why the driller told me to budget for 20 grand and have a bit more saved up just in case it goes deeper than that. He knows that there's no guarantees in this game, and at least he's not trying to sell me false hope. Anyway, as per usual, I don't have any solutions. I'm just using this sympathetic audience to vent my frustration in a safe space, where I know that, at least in the skeptic community, we remember the basics of checking that something works before you risk a buttload of money on it. So for now, I'm just going to lift my pump up, clean out the silt and hope I can get a few more months worth of water out of it before the rain comes back in November. Until then, all I can do is hope for the best and keep saving up for a new bore. Thanks for humouring me, and please stay safe out there. And wash your hands with soap and water if you can.
I'm Mick West. In my podcast, Tales from the Rabbit Hole, I have extended conversations with people who have been involved in conspiracy culture. I do this for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because it's really interesting. These people have great stories about how they fell down the conspiracy theory rabbit hole, what they did down there, and what it was that helped them out. Sometimes I also talk to people who investigate conspiracy theories, and they have equally fascinating stories from the other side. Secondly, I want to understand how best to prevent the spread of conspiracy theories and misinformation, which is an increasing problem in a time when alternative media is exploding. The best way to do this is to communicate effectively with the people involved, and the best way to do that is with a nice long chat. So check it out, Tales from the Rabbit Hole, tftrh.com.
Hello, this is Michelle Bijkersma. You normally hear me on the Logical Fallacy segment, and I'll be doing another one later on in this episode of the Skeptic Zone. But right now, I'd like to talk about what's going on with COVID-19 where I live. Over the last couple of weeks, I've been impressed that locking down and ring-fencing suburbs that are hotspots for COVID-19 has been a really targeted approach that spared everyone else in Melbourne, a city of 5 million people, the burden of lockdown again. The strategy included bringing tests to the residents with mobile units or directing them to the nearest convenient testing site, and Department of Health and Human Services staff were mobilised to knock on doors in order to encourage, or in some cases attempt to convince people to undergo testing. Contact tracers are an essential part of this process too, and are numbered in the thousands in the state of Victoria. Like everyone else, I was hopeful that this was going to be enough to keep the spread of the novel coronavirus well under control. However, recently a sense of, here we go again, started to creep into my thinking as supplies started to disappear from the shelves once again. You'll never guess what it was. Yes, toilet paper. I never miss an episode of CoronaCast, the ABC nightly 10-minute show that takes a deep dive into the most recent issues surrounding the virus. And for some time now, Dr. Norman Swan has been advocating the use of masks when social distancing is difficult or when out in public especially in indoor environments such as shopping malls and on public transport. I began to feel that it was only a matter of time before this would become policy, and so not wanting to risk later delays in the mail, I hopped online and started researching. Further to this, grocery shopping during recent months has made me feel very uncomfortable, as I have felt that people do not adequately keep their distance. So when I read an anecdote on social media about masks causing people to keep away, I began looking for one that would make a statement. No pretty or artistic patterns for me. I went for a bold, plain black. I won't be painting my beloved black and white cat's face on it either, as my family mockingly suggested. My mask arrived a day or two before Melbourne went into stage 3 lockdown. Despite the best efforts by the state government, COVID-19 had spread beyond the hotspot suburbs, resulting in more significant numbers of new cases, and was also creating a dangerous situation in the high-density living areas such as the housing estates in Melbourne. There was a dramatic rise in cases, and the number of new ones leapt up from double digits to triple digits, with worse expected to come. The Chief Health Officer and Premier of Victoria announced that mask wearing in public, for all the reasons Dr Swan had been stating, came later the same day that I first wore my mask out in public, that is, on July 10th. I had an optometrist appointment, so was able to keep this despite the lockdown for medical reasons. I noticed the increase in the number of people who work in the mall wearing masks, but did not see many members of the public doing so. I was the only person wearing a cloth mask, and I expected that people would glare or stare because it is quite conspicuous. However, this was not the case. There were no reactions whatsoever, even from a couple of students that I teach that I passed by and briefly said hello to. I had also read another anecdote on social media that a person who works in retail appreciated customers wearing masks as they encountered so many people in a day, and this further built my confidence to proceed. Interestingly, while sitting in the optometrist, another customer decided to don her mask while in the waiting room too, so I wasn't alone in the end. Until now, the advice in Australia has been against wearing masks. There has been an assumption that people may become complacent about other more important measures such as hand washing or maintaining 1.5 metres of distance, and other problem with untrained laypersons not knowing how to use masks correctly. Until now, there have also been low rates of community transmission, and most cases have come from returning overseas travellers. So mask wearing has not been deemed necessary. However, in Melbourne, community transmission now accounts for 80% of new COVID-19 cases, and this is unprecedented in Australia. Victoria reached a record 288 new cases on Thursday, July the 9th, prompting a change in mask-wearing advice to accompany the Stage 3 lockdown that was put in place for Greater Melbourne and one regional area earlier this week. Premier Dan Andrews has ordered 2 million reusable masks to be provided to the public and another 1 million single-use masks to be given to those facing the highest risk first. Mask wearing has not been made compulsory, however, it is being strongly urged. This has come quite late, as the World Health Organization changed its stance on mask wearing back in mid-June. However, it coincides with the development in the past week that the World Health Organization has declared it will review the new evidence of airborne transmission of the virus. It is still only a recommendation for Victoria, not nationwide, as no other state has a significant level of community transmission, and some appear to be COVID-19 free. Chief Health Officer Dr Brett Sutton released a video on Friday, July 10th that explains everything we need to know about mask wearing as laypersons in Victoria. Amongst other matters already outlined, he explains that either single-use surgical masks or cloth masks with at least 3 layers of a mix of breathable fabrics should be used to ensure adequate protection. He also demonstrates how to fit and wear one correctly, and there are instructions on how to make one at home. He concludes with how to handle the mask safely after it has been worn. The Department of Human Health Services provides a comprehensive guide to face masks, including how to make them. You can follow up all these links in this week's show notes. And for now, this has been Michelle Bijkersma. Stay safe, everyone.
And we'll be cruising today at an altitude of 33,000 feet. So sit back and enjoy the rest of your flight.
Hello, sir. Would that be tea, coffee, or a soft drink today?
Coffee, please.
Here you are.
Thank you.
Tea, coffee, soft drink?
To the Captain, Flight MIB 1965, en route to Tasmania. Dear Captain, as a passenger currently on this flight, seat 86A economy, I wish to point out to you a particularly disconcerting aspect of this journey. Despite what I have been told by so-called science for years, as I gaze out my window into the distance, the horizon appears to me to be quite flat. As hard as I try, I am unable to perceive the expected curvature of the Earth. Are you aware of this unsettling situation? Have you and your co-pilot taken this baffling and worrying observation into account, as I fear it could have an adverse effect on your GPS navigation? I must also advise you that I intend to write a letter of complaint to the Flat Earth Orientation Observation League of Sydney, or FOOLS, to alert them to my discovery. You have been warned. Yours, etc., etc. P.S. I expect a refund of at least 30% of my ticket price, as it is clear to me that this plane is not in fact flying beyond the curve.
Well, what would you like for lunch today, sir? We have a choice of chicken or fish.
What's the fish?
The fish today is flathead, sir.
Right. Chicken, please. Oh, and can you take this letter to the captain?
Is this about the Earth being flat, sir?
Maybe.
Of course, sir. I'll deal with it for you.
The Cass Files with Dr Cassandra Perryman.
Hello, Skeptic Zone listeners. This is Dr. Cassandra Perryman of the Cass Files, and today, in a departure from what you'd normally hear on the Skeptic Zone, we'll be talking about one little piece of the wild world known as American politics. So how does this apply to skepticism? Well, as the US quickly becomes number one in something, meaning global COVID cases, and I'll say as of this recording, we're at over 3 million confirmed cases and 135,000 deaths confirmed to be connected to COVID. So I think it's important to say a little about the party in power. The US has always been a country of contradiction. It was formed out of rebellion, but now views rebellion as a patriotic thing to do only if said rebellion upholds the status quo. Right now, this theme of rebellion and contradiction is on international display. So what are some of the most glaring contradictions? That's been the theme of the last few months here in the US, and that's what I'll be talking about today on the Skeptic Zone. Now, just for you who, don't recall my voice and don't exactly know who I am, I moved back to California in 2016, just before the election of our current, president. Now, I'm not going to use his name. Yes, I know, that's immature, but that's how I'm coping. Anyway, it's amazing to see how the country I knew before that fateful day is just a bleak, pale memory in comparison to the insanity that I'm seeing today. To be fair, this isn't the first time the US has gone completely bug nutty. There were the 80s after all. That era was surreal. My favorite example of the craziness of the 80s, I had to climb under my desk during a nuclear bomb drill. Think about that, because desks are strong enough to withstand a nuclear bomb. Anyway, I'll state right here and up front that this is going to be an intensely political report, and I'm not going to be nice to the Republican Party. That's not to say I couldn't be equally harsh to the Democratic Party, but they're not currently in power, and hence not the ones I'm deeply concerned about. So what are the major contradictions in this administration? First, let's talk about how the Republican Party recently rolled over its platform from 2016 and has adopted that platform through 2024. This means they do not have new policies or directions as a party they have recognized need to be taken. In the preamble of their own platform, starting on the 4th line, it reads, "Our role is, quote, now as an exemplar of liberty for the world to see." And the 7th line says, quote, "We affirm, as did the Declaration of Independence, that all are created equal, endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." It continues down a bit farther, but still in the preamble we get, quote, "We believe our constitutional system, limited government, separation of powers, federalism, and the rights of the people must be preserved uncompromised for future generations." Finally, my favorite part of the preamble reads, quote, "The President," they still mean Obama, "and the Democratic Party have abandoned their promise of being accountable to the American people. They have nearly doubled the size of the national debt." Now, I have only quoted from the preamble, but after reading the entire party platform, I think it sums up the contradictions perfectly. If you want to read something that is just a pure manifesto, I do suggest giving the platform a read. Now we can discuss dichotomies. The party that represents a good portion of our nation has no new policies and predicts no new policies for another 4 years. They're not acknowledging any of the current changes in Zygist or need for progress. They're not supporting coal workers to become clean energy allies. They are not backing reform, which could also substantially reduce government spending. Instead, they are milling in the past and leaving their constituents to mill with them. Is an example of liberty and upholding the ideals of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, they're falling a bit short. The not-so-current habit of undue force, to put it nicely, by excuse of "I was scared" when interacting with minorities is just a small example of how life and liberty are not valued. It is frequently conservative juries that let those same police officers go free when they kill a black person without any true provocation. It's Republicans that support and back the police union, which is now on the hot seat in the U.S. due to their protecting of those same officers. One great example of this is Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker, who in 2017 reduced the power of unions in his state except for police and fire unions. As a note, and as another dichotomy, Republicans are notoriously anti-union. Equality and rights are a huge part of this party platform, but equality and rights under this platform are not for everyone. They're for the wealthy and the white. One way this can clearly be seen is in our voting system. A brief history stop. In 2013, the case of Shelby County v. Holder was heard by the Supreme Court. In a 5-4, in this case it was a party split decision, the Supreme Court struck down key portions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The direct result has been gerrymandering, poll taxes, and ID laws which, as you can guess, have directly impacted minorities, specifically black voters. Somewhere in late 2019, as a response to the surge in midterm election turnout, Republican-led states have been instituting a whole range of blocks to voting. One example is a gerrymandering in Georgia where 7 counties, Shire style you Aussies, have 1 polling place. That's over 6,000 individuals with 1 polling place. We have a term for this. It's called voter suppression. Let's talk about national debt. I love when that talking point comes out. First, it's a metric that is completely out of context, right? Any way you look at it, I can make it good or bad. There's debt that increases income, and there's debt that's just throwing money into a black hole. Democrats are for debt that increases income. Republicans are purely anti-debt. So is the party's chief complaint that the Democrats, specifically Obama, has blown the debt out of control? Well, yes, but no. Obama did increase the national debt by 74% if we don't look at the programs or income generated. That 74 increase is the full culmination in debt over his 8 years as president. Thus far, not including the response and impact due to COVID, the man in charge has increased the national debt by an additional 24%. If we go back to the Republican before him, George W. Bush, the debt was increased by 101%, whereas his predecessor, Clinton, a Democrat, added 32% in debt. When looking at the balance of fiscal debt, Republicans are notorious for being the bigger spenders. We can't forget Reagan, whose administration led to an 186% increase in debt at the end of Carter's last budget. If you want to see a great breakdown of debt additions over the years, fact check me in other words, thebalance.com, all one word, has done a great breakdown. Another great breakdown about how that same fiscally conservative party has let their elected leader go golfing a total of 257 times in the last 3.5 years for a total taxpayer cost of about $136 million. You can see a great breakdown of those outings on TrumpGolfCount.com. In the end, this whole Democrat spend more is just rhetoric to continue to lead business-owning and fiscal conservative voters to lean towards the Republican Party. Speaking of life and liberty and being accountable and all those great buzzwords, I can't even begin to say how insane the response to COVID has been. That's weeks of reporting all on its own. Whatever you have heard on the news, trust me, it's even more insane than that. But anyway, moving on. Another explanation that I think is passed due is why the Republican is so pro-military guns and police. Well, in 1968, the Republican Party named themselves, quote, the Law and Order Party. What else was happening in 1968? Well, Apollo 8 was orbiting the moon. That's pretty cool. Nixon was elected, and we kind of all know how that went. But also, there was a violent police response to the demonstrators at the Chicago Democratic Convention. Those demonstrators included, well, Black Panthers. Most importantly, though, 1968 is when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. In other words, white fragility and civil rights collided. Out of the civil rights movement, we get the Cincinnati coup of the NRA, which happened in 1976 and created the organization you see today. In this era, the shape of police forces changed as a response to the civil rights movements. If you'd like a great breakdown of the history of U.S. policing, I suggest listening to the 6-part series by Behind the Bastards. For a great breakdown of the reason for the coup and abject abject racism in the NRA, I'd suggest listening to the More Perfect podcast, specifically their episode called The Gun Show. So, to say it again, Behind the Bastards 6-part series on policing and More Perfect, The Gun Show. Long story short, the party is incredibly pro-guns, military, and police because they are the only barrier between good, hardworking business owners and white people and those nasty poor people and people of color out to hurt them. Yes, systemic racism is alive and well in the United States and vehemently upheld by the Party of Rights, Accountability, Life, and Liberty. As you can probably tell, I'm a bit passionate on this topic. I feel that right now it's important we all are globally aware. The leadership here is dangerous, and that affects everyone. I've been asked quite a few times if I believe if you know who can get elected again in November. Unfortunately, that reduction in voting rights I was talking about, and the desire to kibosh mail-in voting, which I didn't talk about, is leading to to put it very charitably, a stacked election. I strongly suggest everyone watch that election, and watch the after effects. We've always had a peaceful turnover of power here in the US, but under the current zeitgeist, even that might be tested. I hope not, but we'll see. So from under the glorious auspices of safety brought by the state of California, this is Dr. Cass, signing off.
Be Reasonable is the interview show from the Merseyside Skeptic Society, where each month I speak to someone about their fringe beliefs. Over the years I've spoken to psychics, UFO believers, moon landing deniers, flat earthers, hollow earthers, and all manner of unusual conspiracy theorists. But I've also talked to AIDS denialists, white supremacists, gay conversion therapists. I even interviewed Jim Humble, the inventor of Miracle Mineral Supplement, a form of industrial bleach that he and his followers use to treat cancer and HIV. This isn't a debate show, and my aim isn't to win an argument. But when we listen to how people promote and justify the ideas that we disagree with, even the dangerous ones, I think we become much more effective at countering those ideas. If that sounds like something you'd be interested in, look for Be Reasonable on Apple Podcasts and everywhere else that podcasts live.
Logical fallacies. What are logical fallacies, and why is it important that critical thinkers should know about them? A logical fallacy is an error we can make in reasoning, but it usually crops up when we are discussing or arguing our point of view. Some people might even knowingly use them to try and score cheap points in an argument due to intellectual laziness. They are traps we can fall into, but if we know what to look out for, we can spot them when they occur and stop ourselves from using them. This time we'll look at tu quoque,
also known as the appeal to hypocrisy or the look who's talking. This is a type of ad hominem attack, and comes into play when an inconsistency or hypocrisy from your side is used by your opponent to justify their position or to denigrate your position.
This fallacy really is a lazy and cheap way of trying to justify a position. It can be used to avoid the real argument at hand, deflecting attention to the past actions. It's meeting criticism with criticism.
So what if sometimes creation scientists have been caught out using bad data or fudging research? Just look at mainstream science. Skullduggery goes on all the time.
No doubt about it. Some scientists have and still do fudge figures, cut corners, and even produce faulty research. Not good, but it does not therefore justify or somehow make better the bad science conducted by creationists or from any other field of pseudoscience.
Here in Australia, the CSIRO, the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation, once told us we shouldn't eat eggs due to their high cholesterol content. Now they tell us eggs are fine to eat. How can we trust them with any science?
That science can and does change its mind about things is really one of its great strengths. Imagine if it was more like pseudoscience or religion, that when in the face of new and better information, it stubbornly refused to accept it was wrong. If that were the case, we'd all be back in the 14th century.
Why should we listen to the skeptics? Weren't they the fools who said climate change was a hoax?
The skeptical movement and those in it can and do change their mind. While in the early days of the climate change issue, some skeptics were indeed skeptical of it, these opinions were, over time, changed as more evidence was presented. These days, climate change deniers often, and incorrectly, use the term skeptic to refer to themselves. All of us are fallible, and there will be times when we don't act consistently or even rationally. Whether or not someone follows their own advice or even appears to contradict themselves, it should be noted, but don't let that distract from the question in hand. And ultimately, it does not justify similar action. Knowing a logical fallacy when you hear one, and even knowing its name, is important when arguing your point of view. However, you may come across as arrogant and not get very far if you call it out by name to your opponent when you hear it being used. If your opponent calls you out for using one, it's time to stop and think about how you are making your case. Use your knowledge of logical fallacies wisely, and remember that even if your point of view is right and you know all the pitfalls in arguing your case, it doesn't always mean you'll win on the day. And as skeptics, we must also remember that we too can be wrong at times. I'm Michelle Bijkersma from the Vic Skeptics. Thanks for listening.
I started listening to Ono, Ross and Carey shortly after I broke my arm, and the doctor had told me I'd never walk again.
I couldn't get my book started.
It was just after my landlord died.
I was allergic to water.
Addicted to wheatgrass.
I was lost, honestly.
I knew it was time to make a change, and that's when I turned on my preferred podcasting app.
What if all the answers I was looking for?
What if they were all right here?
There's something about Ono, Ross and Carey that you just can't get anywhere else.
They're thought leaders, discoverers, founders.
I'd call them heroes.
Healers.
Luminaries.
Ross and Carey don't just report on fringe science, spirituality, and claims of the paranormal. They take part themselves.
They show up so you don't have to.
But you might find that you want to.
My arm is better. I can walk again.
6 months. No wheatgrass.
I wrote an entire book this weekend. It's terrible, but I did it.
My landlord came back from the dead.
If I can listen to this podcast, anyone can do it. Just go to MaximumFun.org.
Thank you,
Ross and Carey.
Ono, Ross and Carey is just a podcast. It doesn't do anything. It's just sounds you listen to in your ears. All these people are made up. Goodbye.
And now, a reading from the Book of Tim with Tim Mendham.
Hi, my name is Tim Mendham. I'm the editor of Australian Skeptics journal The Skeptic and executive officer for Australian Skeptics Inc. And today I'll be talking about an article from The Skeptic from September 2016, which is volume 36, number 3. and it comes from the section that we call What Goes Around, where a story starts off in one place and goes all the way around and ends up where it started from. And this one is about monsters, mysteries and medicos. The Strange Case of Dr Jekyll and Mr Hyde is a novella first published in 1886 by the Scottish author Robert Louis Stevenson. It's about a London lawyer named Gabriel John Utterson who investigates strange occurrences between his old friend, Dr Henry Jekyll, and his evil alter ego, Edward Hyde. The title has become a well-used phrase for someone's dramatically changed personalities. Stevenson had long been intrigued by the idea of how personalities can affect a human and how to incorporate the interplay of good and evil into a story. While still a teenager, he had developed a script for a play about Deacon Brodie. Now, William Deacon Brodie was a Scottish cabinet maker, deacon of a trades guild and Edinburgh City Councillor, who maintained a secret life as a burglar, partly for the thrill and partly to fund his gambling. Brodie used his daytime job as a way to gain knowledge about the security mechanisms of his clients and to duplicate keys using wax impressions. He was caught, tried and hanged in 1788. Popular myth held that he had built the first gallows in Edinburgh and was also its first victim. William Ruffhead in Classics Crime says that after research, he was sure that although the deacon may have had some hand in the design, it was certainly not of his construction, nor was he the first to benefit by its ingenuity. Now, William Ruffhead, which is actually pronounced Rockhead, was a well-known Scottish lawyer and amateur criminologist, as well as an editor and essayist on matters criminis. For almost 60 years, he attended most of the noteworthy murder trials at the High Court of Justiciary in Scotland. He was an important early practitioner of the modern true crime literary genre. Perhaps Rockhead's greatest achievement was his analysis of Oscar Slater's trial for the murder of the Glasgow spinster Marion Gilchrist in 1908. Rockhead assisted Arthur Conan Doyle, Craigie Acheson and William Park for nearly 20 years, exposing weaknesses in the Crown's case, and was cited as a witness in the 1928 appeal. Sir Arthur Ignatius Conan Doyle was a British writer and physician who studied medicine at the University of Edinburgh. He popularised the mystery of the Mare Celeste and showed a great interest and belief in spiritualism, psychic powers and, of course, the Cottingley fairies. He was a prolific writer whose works range across fantasy and science fiction stories, plays, romances, poetry, non-fiction and historical novels, including his preferred work, The White Company. But of course he's most noted for creating the fictional detective Sherlock Holmes, a character that featured in 56 short stories and 4 novels. Holmes was partially modelled on Doyle's former university teacher, Dr Joseph Bell. Doyle met Bell in 1877 and served as his clerk at the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary. Bell was personal surgeon to Queen Victoria during her visits to Scotland. Doyle admitted that Holmes was loosely based on Bell and his observant ways. Bell was aware of this inspiration and took some pride in it. According to Irving Wallace in an essay from his book The Fabulous Originals, Bell was involved in several police investigations, such as the Ardlamont mystery of 1893. He also gave his analysis of the Jack the Ripper murders to Scotland Yard. The link between Holmes and Bell was obvious to another writer who wrote to Doyle from his island home. I hope you will allow me to offer you my compliments on your very ingenious and very interesting adventures of Sherlock Holmes. Only the one thing troubles me. Can this be my old friend Joe Bell? In the local island tongue, the correspondent was called Tusitala, teller of tales. He was also composer of more than 100 musical pieces. Doyle planned to extend a September 1894 tour of America to meet up with the correspondent, but the latter died in December. 40 island chiefs carried his body to its resting place on Mount Via, Samoa. The correspondent was, of course, Robert Louis Stevenson, author of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And that was What Goes Around from The Skeptic, September 2016. And you can download all the issues of The Skeptic, dating back to 1981, from our website skeptics.com.au for free.
Thank you for listening to The Skeptic Zone, and thank you to Michelle Franklin, Michelle Bijkersma, Dr Cassandra Perryman, and Tim Mendham for helping make this week's show so interesting. And thank you to my friend Sierra Joan, who played the part of the cabin attendant in the little typewriter sketch earlier on. Coming up on next week's show, more Logical Fallacies from Michelle Bijkersma, and hopefully, possibly, I think, we'll do another think tank. We'll get a selection of reporters and maybe a special guest or two and talk about skeptical issues of the day. Whatever happened to the UFOs and the Bigfoots? That's what I want to know. Thank you to those people who continue to support the Skeptic Zone via your kind weekly contributions, or monthly, if it's Patreon, sort of, at skepticzone.tv. Just go there and click on the link for Patreon or PayPal. And as I always say, and as you know full well, it's only due to your kind contributions that the show keeps going. So yes, thank you very much. But for this week, this is Richard Saunders signing off from Sydney, Australia. You've been listening to the Skeptic Zone podcast. Please visit our website at www.skepticzone.tv for show notes, contacts, and to access the back catalogue of episodes going back to 2008. You can follow the Skeptic Zone podcast on Twitter at Skeptic Zone, visit our Facebook page, or leave a review on iTunes. You can also support the Skeptic Zone via Patreon or PayPal. The Skeptic Zone podcast is an independent production. The views and opinions expressed on the Skeptic Zone are not necessarily those of Australian Skeptics or any other skeptical organisation. Hello to the afterthoughts, the people who listen after the music ends to play the dice game. If you haven't heard this section of the show before, if you're new or I don't know what, you fall asleep during the show. A lot of people fall asleep. Wake up! The show's over. Wake up and play the dice game. I've got a D10, a 10-sided die here. I'm going to roll it 3 times. And you can use your magic ability to see if you can guess or predict what numbers will come up on the die. So, here we go. This is the Susan Gerbic dice here. They're all 5s. It's going to come up 5 now. No, it's not. Susan always picks 5. Okay, Susan and everybody, here we go. Rolling the first one of 3 rolls. Giving it a good shake and... Why aren't I filming this? Why aren't I filming this, Susan? It's 5. Good grief. People don't believe me. They say I just make up funny numbers to, suit the occasion or whatever. I don't. Okay. Second roll coming up. So the first one was 5. Second roll. 10, you see. Well, that's 2 times 5, I suppose. Just make a note of that. Last one. Here we go. Final number is 1. So, this week's winning numbers: 5, 10, and 1. And if you had 5, 10, and 1, your prize is you get to listen to next week's show, just like everybody else.